What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and because of everything that we've done in Absolute Power, a lot of you guys were asking me to get you caught up on the Green Lantern mythos in DC Comics. And so what I want to do is I want to cover this first volume, a lot of the things that have gone on. But for those of you guys who are familiar with Green Lantern, kind of bear with me here, because for a lot of new people, I want to kind of break down the Green Lantern mythos in a pretty quick and dirty way and kind of explain everything that's going on here. So first things first, the current run is by Jeremy Adams, and issues 1 and 2 are more just foundational and set the stage, because between issues 2 and 3, we got Night Terrors, so it didn't really have a huge bearing on everything that's going on. The long and short of this is that for Hal Jordan himself, he had quit the Green Lantern Corps following the disappearance of the Guardians of the Universe and the fact that the United Planets had just taken over the Green Lantern Corps itself. And so what he did is when he came back to Earth in the first issue of Jeremy Adams' run, he faced off against a guy named Steel Fury. And what it did is it essentially reconstituted his ring. But because of the powers of Steel Fury, the fact that it was tied into the willpower mythos of the Green Lantern, which we'll talk about here in a second, Hal Jordan got a new ring, and we don't fully understand how his ring works. All we know is that the powers are different from the powers that we traditionally see with Green Lantern, but we're seeing how those like unfold and change and grow and different things along those lines. But moving into the idea of like Sinestro, the emotional spectrum, the significance of Carol Ferris, different things like that. Sinestro was at one point a Green Lantern, as most of you guys probably know from that terrible Ryan Reynolds Green Lantern movie back in the day. Ultimately, he was ousted. And so what Sinestro did is he formed what was called the Sinestro Corps, and it tied into the fear aspect of the emotional spectrum. Because the emotional spectrum itself is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's just the source of how emotions work and different things along those lines. But each aspect of the emotional spectrum ties into the Green Lantern mythos. Green Lanterns use the willpower aspect. Sinestro uses fear. Blue Lanterns use hope, so on and so forth. A White Lantern is the result of somebody who masters all the emotions of the emotional spectrum and the rings that go along with it. And there's more to it, right? You know, the very essences, right? Ion and the whale and so on and so forth. And we don't need to go into that per se. Again, we're doing the quick and dirty thing. What was really cool about Sinestro, and the reason why he's so important and why there's such a massive grudge between Hal Jordan and Sinestro, is that while Sinestro had been an enemy of Hal Jordan for years in DC Comics, it wasn't really until you got to Sinestro Corps War that things popped off. And the reason why was because up until that point, the Guardians of the Universe, much like Batman, had a no-killing rule as the creators of the Green Lantern rings, right? And so when the Sinestro Corps War broke out, the greatest story of Green Lantern in the history of DC Comics, the Sinestro Corps was killing Green Lanterns everywhere they found them. And then finally, the Guardians of the Universe allowed Green Lanterns to kill. And it was an amazing point in the story, right? Like literally, the Green Lanterns are on the ropes, they're being annihilated at every turn, and then just this command comes in, right? Lethal force is authorized, and all hell breaks loose, right? Like literally, it's just this massive battle across the universe where Green Lanterns are killing Yellow Lanterns are killing Green Lanterns. Like, it was an amazing story. But ever since then, right, due to Sinestro's campaign to annihilate the entirety of the Green Lantern Corps, it's just been an extreme grudge. And everything else after that have just kind of been battles in this ongoing personal war between Hal Jordan and Sinestro. Carol Ferris is important because she's been this kind of on-again, off-again girlfriend of Hal Jordan, but specifically, she ended up becoming the Star Sapphire, which is to say the leader of the Star Sapphire Corps. But with all that out of the way, right, the reason why all this matters is because going into really issue number 3 here, and what's important with the Green Lantern mythos at the moment, it opens up with Hal Jordan falling out of the sky. Because again, when he tried to leave Earth, his ring essentially shut down. Now, when he lands back here, because his ring just, you know, of course, reactivates, he kind of starts to experiment with what the ring is capable of, because he doesn't fully understand it. Now, one of the things that happens is that he kind of talks about how like there's no artificial intelligence here as there normally is with Green Lantern rings. So in your travels, if you ever looked up Green Lantern, you would see instances where like Hal Jordan would talk to his ring would talk back. There was an artificial intelligence in there. And so what he does is he kind of performs a bit of an experiment. And he says, I haven't done this in a while. My first ring, Abin Sur's ring, could make constructs in various colors. By changing the width and transparency of the construct, I can refract light differently. And so that's a really, really awesome addition to his powers, because now it grants the ability of camouflage, right? If somebody tries to attack him, he can use his ring and spawn 50 versions of himself. And unless somebody has the wherewithal, like telepathy or an understanding of what his ring's capable of, or just experience, they won't be able to know which one of those 50 versions of Hal Jordan is the actual Hal Jordan. And so what you do do is you switch over to Coast City, which is the home city of Green Lantern in the DC Comics universe, and you pick up with Sinestro. And Sinestro arrives here and realizes that these two folks who are seemingly in this giant tower up here are basically individuals in disguise, right? And they're just running a kind of nefarious campaign underground, different things like that. They're an in-between here, right? They're an intermediary, a means to an end. Because what Sinestro needs is people, right? He needs like henchmen of some kind. And while they can't necessarily give him people, I mean, they could, they end up giving him something better. They give him basically superpowered henchmen, one of which is like King Shark, things along those lines. But all this is done for the purpose of Sinestro traveling to Ferris Air Base and then just appearing before these different, jets that are there. And we'll talk about why that matters here in a second. But Ferris Air Base is, of course, run by Carol Ferris. Hal Jordan was a test pilot at Ferris Air Base, and that's kind of how the two of them met and ultimately fell in love and different things like that. But again, there is a kind of back and forth here, some foundational work that's being done where Nathan, working at Ferris Air, is of course engaged to Carol Ferris. The two of them have their own romantic connection now. And so the reason why he's been called here by Carol is she says somebody broke into the airbase and all we really have is some security footage that shows that it's Sinestro. And Carol Ferris, having been a Star Sapphire, having been involved in conflict with all the other Lanterns and things like that, she knows enough about Sinestro to know he's not here indiscriminately. There's some greater plan that's going on here. And the plan's really, really dope. It's really, really cool. But even Hal Jordan himself kind of muses about his history with Sinestro, because one of the things to grasp is that Sinestro is exceedingly capable. He's a master manipulator. He is a master strategist, right? He's not some villain of the week. What's going to be interesting about this is that that's actually not the case. And Sinestro is acting more out of desperation than anything else. But while Hal Jordan is here, Sinestro actually comes and finds him, as opposed to Hal Jordan traveling around and trying to locate Sinestro. And so as the two of them start talking here, what happens is Sinestro kind of calls Hal Jordan's bluff in the sense that Hal's prepared for this, right? And in fact, he conjures a construct that's just like a giant sword sitting under the table. But the conversation between the two is awesome because what happens is Sinestro says, so here's the thing, right? Yes, you have a giant dagger pointed at me, right? A giant sword that's pointed at me, and yes, you could kill me. But if you do, 3 sonic devices around this city will detonate, and Coast City will get obliterated again, which kind of ties back and calls back to the events that led up to Emerald Twilight. There's more to it, but we don't have to go into all the ins and outs of that kind of stuff. It would lead us to sidetrack in the video. The important thing is that it wouldn't be the first time that Coast City was destroyed. And with Hal Jordan, of course, having so much love for his city, then he asks Sinestro, what do you want? And Sinestro's response, the only thing you have of worth, Jordan, your ring. And there's a kind of taunting that goes on here, right? Did yours run out of power? And the response of Sinestro, something like that. And Hal says, no dice. I give you this ring, you'll destroy more than this city. And the response of Sinestro, because he's never really an overly emotional guy, slams his fists on the table and says, I do not want to destroy your city. And that's the first hint to Hal Jordan that something's wrong here. Because when it comes to Sinestro as a person, he is cold, calculating, ruthless. And while he can get emotional, he's usually not, right? He's exceedingly arrogant and he always believes he has an ace up his sleeve, right? And for the most part, he does, right? He usually does. And so Sinestro says, I don't want to destroy this city, Jordan, not if you give me what I want. And what I want is to leave this mud hole behind and return to my home. You can understand that, can't you? Now, behind the scenes, what Sinestro knows that Hal Jordan doesn't know is the United Planets are not just some organization and coming together of different planets. The whole thing is ran by Tharos. And what he's doing is basically replacing ambassadors of these worlds with shapeshifters that answer directly to him. So it's just kind of a stealthy way to conquer the universe. And Karuger was one of the planets that fell. Now again, Hal Jordan kind of knows this, but doesn't know this. He understands the nefarious nature of the council, but he doesn't know how far reaching all this stuff goes. But Sinestro does. And so that's why Hal Jordan asked the question, and you need my ring to do it. Did the Legion of Doom run out of cash for a boom tube or some kind of dimensional rift? And the response of Sinestro, it seems your beloved United Planets is making travel to and from this forsaken sector harder than it should be. The ring will assure my departure. And that's where Hal begins to kind of put the pieces together, even if only on a surface level, where he realizes the United Planets are seemingly coming after Sinestro, right? He abandoned the United Council just like Hal Jordan did. And so Hal's just kind of like, okay, they're after you, aren't they? Right? And that's where Sinestro's like, yes, and they'll be after you as soon as they find out that you have a ring. So really, I'm keeping you out of a United Planet cell. And the response to Jordan is, I don't really care, but it doesn't really matter to me. And so ultimately he hands the ring over because he's just sort of buying time trying to grab information. But this is when we learn one of the other things about Hal Jordan's ring, that a Green Lantern ring can be used by a person who puts it on, but Jordan's ring is different. It will not work if it's not Hal Jordan. It can only be used by him specifically. And so Sinestro's just kind of like, that's a pity, and then detonates the sonic bombs. Now, this is cool because what ends up happening is that when Sinestro takes off, he tells Hal Jordan, you have one of two choices. You can pursue me and leave Coast City to die, or you can allow me to escape and save Coast City. It's a classic scheme from Sinestro and really just villains in general, right? And Sinestro says, you're not fast enough to do both. The response of Green Lantern, I'm not, but I know someone who is. So he calls in Barry Allen. And a lot of that's because there's just such a long history between Hal Jordan and Barry Allen, the Flash, as like superheroes. But because these guys are so close and because they're such great friends, Hal Jordan conjures a construct that is thin enough to be able to pick up on the vibrational frequency of these sonic bombs. The Flash, being as fast as he is able to basically travel to all these different locations and basically find these bombs. And then of course, Green Lantern, Hal Jordan destroys them. What is cool about this is it sets the stage for like another kind of use for his ring, and even how it's really unique to Hal himself in the sense that he starts creating multiple constructs at the same time. And so what happens with the two of them working together, and because of Barry Allen's capabilities when it comes to just like forensics and stuff like that, that he takes him to Ferris Air Base and is like, Sinestro was here. We don't know why he was here, but he was here. Can you take a look at these drone jets, right? These non-manned planes, and like give me an idea of what he may have been doing here. And so by going through and analyzing these different jets, Barry Allen picks up on the fact that like something has been put here, right? Like something's been placed in this thing. And so what goes on is that between Hal Jordan and Barry Allen and Carol Ferris, they're kind of like, okay, let's call in Terrific, right? Mr. Terrific, and see what they can offer us in terms of any kind of modifications that have been made here. But it's going to take time for that to happen. Instead, you do get a kind of side story where there's basically somebody who attacks the city of Los Angeles, and then the Flash and Green Lantern team up to basically deal with it. It's not really overly important, but while that's going on and there's a kind of distraction, the drones automatically activate and they take off. And that's when you find out that this is all the doing of Sinestro, who's sending them out there into the world to launch an attack. But even Hal Jordan doesn't fully understand why, right? Now, again, this all kind of goes into the idea of Sinestro becoming a Red Lantern here, but the only real concern of Hal Jordan in the here and now is trying to find a way to stop Sinestro. But what happens is that Sinestro, right before the attack, addresses the world publicly and says, complacent. The people of this planet have become complacent. You elect politicians that weaponize greed. You have let the lawless run rampant in your street. You have allowed your children to be exploited, your females to debase themselves, and your men to whimper about what goes on around them without ever lifting a finger to help. You have claimed weakness as strength, but no longer. Sometimes, to break the shackles of complacency, you must be confronted with the fragility of your existence. You must be exposed to the lawlessness you have turned your backs to. You must feel the full fury of fear, and just launches this attack, right? And just starts blowing stuff up all over the place. Now, this is all in the midst of like Carol Ferris and them trying to secure a contract with the Pentagon. So it's like the worst thing that could happen, right? Hey guys, we created these cool drones, man. Like, let's do a contract. And the Pentagon's like, okay, cool. And then someone takes them over. Right? And so at this point, it's a joint venture between Ferris Air and the United States government trying to find a way to track these drones while Hal Jordan starts taking them down. He successfully takes down one of them, but there's 3 left. And so at that point, Sinestro's like, activate the cloak. And so now these jets cannot be tracked by the federal government or Ferris Air or anybody. It all comes down to Hal Jordan. The last one that they were able to detect was on its way to Tokyo. And again, this is when you start to get into the new powers of Jordan's ring, because what he does is he says, okay, I can manipulate light to create different color constructs. So let's use this creatively, right? This might mean I can use it to filter various wavelengths of light through my construct. So he creates a visor, and like a predator sifting through these different wavelengths, he picks up on where this jet is. It's genius, right? I love what's happening with Hal Jordan and his ability to use his constructs in new and interesting ways, because for years he was just the guy that would make a giant fist and punch you with it, which was amazing, right? But it's cool. But then you start to realize what's actually happening here when Sinestro looks down at his hand and he has his yellow ring. Because what goes on, and Hal Jordan is the one to figure it out, he starts to piece together that what Sinestro is trying to do is instill fear in the populace of Earth. The hope being that if everybody on Earth feels enough fear, it'll charge his ring. Because Sinestro does not really need a central battery per se to charge his ring. He just needs fear, and that's it. And so what Hal Jordan does is he actually flies down to this site where all this destruction has happened, and he makes this kind of impassioned speech to everybody on TV who's listening to this, right? And talks about how people on Earth can't really be defeated that easily, that we always bounce back because of courage and things like that. And it's a way to counter the fear that so many people feel. And so in effect, it just end runs the efforts of Sinestro. And so at that point, it's just dealing with the two other jets that are out there. What's crazy is that in talking to Carol Ferris, one jet that's cloaked is heading to Washington, DC. The other cloaked jet is heading to Moscow. And what would seemingly happen here is that both governments would respond with nuclear arsenals. And what better way to instill fear among an entire populace than instilling in them the idea that the end times are upon them, right? That would supercharge his ring to whole different levels. And so Hal Jordan basically conjures two different constructs and sends them to two different places across the world, and then tells Carol Ferris a way in which they can track these jets. Ultimately, the constructs locate them and then in turn obliterate these jets. And so the world has essentially been saved by Hal Jordan, but it pisses Sinestro off to no end because his henchmen bail. They're like, we got to get out of here, man. Like, we have to leave. They're going to find us. And Green Lantern shows up here. Now, here's what's awesome is because now you really get to see Sinestro when he's at his most incensed. Because Green Lantern says, did you really think that you could scare my planet, scare my people, for what? Jumpstart your ring? Become the great and mighty Sinestro once again? How did that work out? And the response of Sinestro is, I came here for help, you imbecile. Something is wrong with the emotional spectrum. You must have felt it by now. But after our encounter, my ring was gone. I was stranded on the streets of your world, powerless. There was a little girl, a child. She saw me standing there, and she smiled. There was no fear. And why would she be afraid? I was toothless. Me, Sinestro, while Karuger was undoubtedly in trouble. I looked for ways home, Jordan, but the United Planets was guarding what went in and what went out. What could I do? I had to make people afraid of me again. I needed to instill enough fear in your planet of lawless apes to allow me to charge my ring. I was doing you a favor, really, but then you had to stop me, the hero, the optimist. And where Hal Jordan makes the comment, not sorry to disappoint you, the response of Sinestro is, disappoint me? No, Hal Jordan of Sector 2814, you have not disappointed me. You've done something more. You've given me a gift. You've filled me with rage. Now, here's the thing about this, right? When it comes to the Red Lanterns and the Red Lantern rage, it doesn't really require a central power battery. All it requires is a person maintaining constant rage, just constantly being pissed off. But as those of you guys who are familiar with the Lantern mythos know, this is kind of a crazy situation, because if Sinestro really is wielding a Red Lantern ring here, then that means if he tries to remove the ring, it'll kill him, right? Now, it doesn't look like he's wielding a true Red Lantern ring, just because of the fact that if he was, he would be like foaming at the mouth with like red foam and blood and all that kind of crazy stuff. But he is channeling the rage aspect of the emotional spectrum. What it looks like here is Sinestro has figured out a way to start pulling different elements from the emotional spectrum or different powers from the emotional spectrum, like drawing a Rolodex, which all you young whippersnappers have no idea what that is. What's cool here though, is that the only way to counter the power of a Red Lantern ring is with a Blue Lantern ring of hope, that the Blue Lanterns charge Green Lanterns and depower Red Lanterns. But there's no Blue Lantern around here anywhere, right? So what to be done? The funny thing, and I love the way that Jeremy Adams does this, because had they not appeared here, the question you'd be asking is like, where are all the other superheroes with something crazy like this happening? Batman and them are observing what's going on, but Batman's dealing with all the stuff in his comics that were going on at this point in time, right? Failsafe and all that kind of cool stuff. Superman and the Superman family could get involved, but the problem humans, the emotional spectrum emits kryptonite-like energy at times. So if they show up there, they could die, right? So ultimately, everybody's hands off. It just comes down to like Hal Jordan and Sinestro. But I love that Jeremy Adams answers that question. What's important here is that Sinestro, wielding Red Lantern energy, despite not actually possessing a Red Lantern ring, is really dope. And I'm really excited to see what this means for the Green Lantern mythos. What is cool about this, though, is that Hal Jordan kind of muses about this, right? Sinestro's always been calm, always been logical. Now he's fighting with just unbridled rage, right? Indiscriminately throwing out constructs and things like that. And so because of this, Hal Jordan has to kind of figure out the next step here, right? How does he, as a Green Lantern that seems inherently weak to the Red Lanterns, suddenly find a way to overpower a Red Lantern? But that's when you learn about one of the new abilities of his ring. He says, "Strange, my ring is glowing. I can feel it as if it's supercharged. What is going on here?" And he says, "I can feel the energy of this place, something powering the ring. Whatever it is, I hope it's enough, because if I don't stop Sinestro here, I don't think he will stop." And so what happens is Hal Jordan takes a page directly out of Kyle Rayner by creating a construct that's a giant mech. Now, the reason why I say this is a page out of Kyle Rayner is because that's what differentiated him from Hal Jordan. Historically speaking, in DC Comics, Hal Jordan would make like a giant boxing glove, right? Or a giant hand to catch somebody or something like that. But there wasn't really much in the way of creativity. He was fairly vanilla in terms of how he used his powers. When it came to Kyle Rayner, and the reason why fans loved Kyle Rayner so much was that he was a comic book artist in the DC universe when he got his Green Lantern ring. So he would create mechs, or an army of mechs. He would create these crazy exotic constructs using his Green Lantern ring, and fans who were reading the comics loved it at the time. But this is just like one of those stories where it turns into a giant conflict between like a giant robot and a monster. I know the Japanese term is like Jaeger, but kaiju, that's what it is. It's a giant fight between a Jaeger and a kaiju. It's pretty awesome. But that's what's crazy here is Sinestro is fighting like a man possessed. He doesn't care about any collateral damage or anything. And so Hal Jordan just kind of observes this and says he's putting off so much energy, he's going to destroy everything within miles unless I have to contain this power. And he's like, ultimately, I think I got it, right? The worst of it, but I feel completely wiped. And so he talks to Sinestro and says, you have to stop this. The rage isn't normal. You don't know what it will do. And the response of Sinestro, what it will do is get me back to Kruger. The consequences be damned. My home world was taken from me and I will have it back. And then I will raise this universe from one end to the next. I will show everyone that the rage of Sinestro is to be more than feared. And so ultimately, he just takes off. And while Hal Jordan goes after him to a degree, again, he's limited, right? Because his ring can't go that far into space. And so what he does is he ends up traveling back to his trailer to try to think things over. And it's him just sort of conversing with Kilowog. And he just kind of says, Sinestro, right? Somehow he's manifested Red Lantern energy and almost ripped the earth in half. Something's wrong with the emotional spectrum, Kilowog. Something's wrong up there. I can feel it. And this voice comes out of nowhere and says, you're right, Lantern Jordan, but it seems something is wrong down here as well. I've come a long way through the United Planets blockade to find my former ally, my friend, talking to a construct of Kilowog. What is going on, Lantern Jordan? Now, the person that's talking to Green Lantern is Razor. And Razor was at one point a Red Lantern who defected and joined the Blue Lantern Corps and has seemingly been there ever since. And he seems to be the reason why Hal Jordan's ring was amped up in the fight with Sinestro. But Hal Jordan, in seeing him and taking in what he says, just says Kilowog is dead. And it's all my fault because this Kilowog who was here was just a hard light construct that was manipulating light to make him look real. He hasn't been here and he hasn't been alive for quite some time. Now, in terms of the reason why he died is a topic for the next video. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. I told you Green Lantern is dope, but I will catch you all later. Peace.